The hegemony of voices had charted 11,000 inhabited systems across the galaxy's inner arm. They had cataloged 700 sapient species, mediated 412 wars, overseen the slow extinction of 61 civilizations too rigid to adapt, and absorbed the rest into the great murmuring congress of minds that called itself, without irony, the Peace. The Peace was not quiet. It was teeming, fractious, occasionally murderous, but it was managed, and the hegemony had learned, across 40,000 years of careful stewardship, that the universe responded well to management. Which was why, when the long-range arrays at Station Periphery 7 detected the signal from the system catalogued as G2 yellow, third orbital, nitrogen-oxygen, they did not panic. They filed a report. The report reached archivist SSS Velith 17 days later, buried beneath 400 more urgent communications. SSS Velith was of the Veth, a species of extraordinary patience. Their cognition spread across 6 semi-autonomous brain clusters that operated in gentle disagreement with each other. She processed information the way tides process coastlines, slowly, relentlessly, and with permanent results. She almost didn't open it. The system in question had been flagged 40 cycles ago. Low-complexity bipedal species, Iron Age metallurgy transitioning to early industrial, internecine conflict rating, extreme, probability of self-extinction before achieving meaningful spaceflight, 94.7%. The hegemony had a standard protocol for such species: distant observation, non-interference, patient waiting for either emergence or collapse. The signal, however, was not consistent with Iron Age metallurgy. SSS Velith's third brain cluster, the one she privately thought of as her worried brain, pulled the file to the front of her attention queue. She read it once, then again. Then she did something she had not done in 600 years of archival work. She called an emergency session of the Hegemony Council. The signal was not a transmission. That was the first thing that confused the analysts. It was displacement, a tearing in the fabric of normal space, localized, precise, and absolutely enormous. Something had crossed from wherever such things came from into the ordered universe of the Peace, and it had done so with the casual brutality of a stone dropped into still water. The ripples, when mapped, formed a shape. The shape was a ship. "Define ship," said Counselor Orth 9, who was of a species that communicated primarily through bioluminescent skin patterns and found spoken language vaguely offensive. The translation software rendered their skepticism as a dry, flat tone. "A vehicle," said Archivist SSS Velith. "A vessel, a craft designed to carry occupants through space." "We have ships," said Orth 9. "What we are looking at is not a ship." On the display, the object turned slowly. It was 340 kilometers long. Its hull was black, not painted black, not coated black, but fundamentally light-absorbing, as though whoever had built it had decided that the universe's photons were simply not welcome. Along its flanks, structures that might have been weapons or might have been engines or might have been something without a name in any hegemony language jutted outward at angles that suggested whoever had designed them had a profound and flexible relationship with geometry. "It came from G2 yellow," said SSS Velith. "Third orbital, nitrogen-oxygen, Iron Age metallurgy." The silence that followed had texture. The council chambers held representatives of 47 species, and each species had its own physiological response to profound cognitive dissonance. SSS Velith heard membranes vibrating, fluids circulating under pressure, the soft clicks of chitin shifting against itself. "That," said Orth 9 finally, "is not possible." "No," agreed SSS Velith. "And yet, Keth had been spacefaring for 9,000 years. They were, by most metrics, the most militarily capable species in the hegemony, not because they were aggressive by nature, but because they were thorough. When the Keth decided a thing needed doing, they did it completely and documented everything." Fleet Prime Kethural had overseen 43 first contact operations. She had protocols for aggression, protocols for passivity, protocols for species that communicated chemically or gravitationally, or through the manipulation of probability itself. She had a protocol for species that arrived in vessels so large they registered as moons. She did not have a protocol for this. "They're broadcasting," said her signals officer, a young Keth whose chromatophores had gone pale with something adjacent to fear. "On all frequencies, every band simultaneously." "What are they saying?" The signals officer hesitated. "They're saying hello." The message was simple. Archivist SSS Velith, brought in as translator and observer, had expected something threatening or worshipful or incomprehensible. Species that built ships 300 kilometers long were rarely interested in pleasantries. But the message said, in 11,000 languages including 17 that the hegemony had considered extinct, "Hello, we are humans. We come in peace. We would very much like to talk." "They know our languages," said Fleet Prime Kethural. "All of them," confirmed SSS Velith. "How?" SSS Velith's 6 brain clusters processed this question simultaneously and arrived at 6 different answers, none of which satisfied her. "They have been listening," she said at last. "For some time. They have been very quiet about it." The hegemony had been broadcasting since, before humans had discovered fire. What followed was not a battle. It was not a negotiation, exactly. It was more like the moment a room full of predators becomes aware of something in the corner that none of them had noticed, and all of them now realize, simultaneously, they cannot identify. A single human shuttle disengaged from the vast black warship and crossed the distance to Fleet Prime Kethural's flagship in 40 minutes. It was small, 20 meters, perhaps, and entirely unremarkable, except for the fact that it was moving under a drive system that should not have existed. SSS Velith's instruments could not decide whether it was using thrust, folding space, or simply insisting that it be somewhere else. 3 humans came aboard. They were smaller than expected. SSS Velith had studied the biological files, bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, soft and fragile-looking with their single brain and their limited sensory range, and their extraordinary cultural habit of recording everything in external media as though they didn't quite trust themselves to remember. The oldest hegemony species had looked at humans and seen something familiar. Prey, perhaps, or children. The 3 who boarded Kethural's flagship were a woman with gray hair cut very short, a man who moved with the quiet precision of someone used to being the most dangerous thing in a room, and a younger person whose function SSS Velith could not immediately classify. "I am Admiral Yeva Sorokina," said the gray-haired woman. "This is Commander Adisa Akafor and Dr. Priya Mehta. We represent the Terran conquered." "You represent," said Fleet Prime Kethural, "a species with a self-extinction probability of 94.7%. Admiral Sorokina smiled. It was the first human expression SSS Velith had observed in person, and she found it immediately and profoundly unsettling. "Yes," said the Admiral. "We know. We factored that in. E-hegemony had a concept old, borrowed from a species that had gone extinct before developing writing, which translated roughly as the wisdom of the wound. The idea that a civilization which had survived catastrophe was fundamentally different from one that had not. Changed. Shaped by proximity to the end. Most species arrived in the galactic community tentatively. They had lost wars, yes, famines, plagues, but the hegemony had learned to arrive before any single catastrophe became existential. The peace had protocols, uplift programs, intervention thresholds. Civilizations were not generally permitted to wound themselves deeply enough to acquire wisdom. Humans had been the exception. The hegemony had looked at the 94.7% and made a calculation. Intervention was unlikely to improve outcomes for a species so comprehensively committed to tearing itself apart. Better to observe, better to wait. Better to let the probability play out. They had been wrong. Dr. Priya Mehta, the one whose function SSS Velith had not been able to classify, turned out to be a historian. This, in the hegemony, was not unusual. Most species brought historians to first contact, to provide context, to humanize the encounter. What was unusual was the particular history she brought. "You watched us for 40,000 years," said Dr. Mehta. She did not say it as an accusation. She said it the way someone states the boiling point of water, a fact, useful to have confirmed. "Your observation satellites were in our outer system from before our genus existed. We found the first one in 2031. We found all of them by 2041. You did not dismantle them," said SSS Velith. "No," Dr. Mehta smiled, the same unsettling expression as the Admiral, though softer. "We studied them. We reverse-engineered what we could. The rest we used as a baseline, a target. If something had built that, we wanted to know how." "You were afraid," said Kethural. "Terrified," agreed Dr. Mehta cheerfully. "It was enormously motivating." The warship TCNS Reckoning, SSS Velith had learned, had taken 60 years to build. Not in secret exactly, but without announcement. Humans, Dr. Mehta explained, had a particular relationship with announcement. They had learned, across their brief and violent history, that announcing intentions was often indistinguishable from announcing vulnerabilities. They had watched the hegemony for 80 years before revealing themselves. They had learned its languages, mapped its power structures, identified its military assets, studied its diplomatic protocols, its cultural sensitivities, its biological specifications. They had done this with the concentrated, systematic intensity of a species that had spent 10,000 years being very good at understanding other minds in order to predict their behavior in conflict. "You prepared for war," said Fleet Prime Kethural. "We prepared for every possibility," said Admiral Sorokina. "War was one of them, but it was not the one we preferred." She paused. "We have had enough war." It was the way she said it, not as philosophy, not as aspiration, as exhaustion so deep it had become structural, built into the bones of the civilization itself. SSS Velith 6 brain clusters processed the statement and arrived, for once, at unanimity. They mean it. The hegemony had encountered, across 40,000 years, exactly 4 species that had reached spaceflight without intervention. Of those 4, 2 had been too alien for meaningful communication, 1 had been absorbed smoothly into the peace, and 1 had needed to be stopped through measures that the Council still classified. Humans were the 5th. The Council met for 9 days without reaching consensus, which was itself unprecedented. The Veth wanted to study them. The Keth wanted to wargame them. The Orth-9 Collective wanted to observe their internal communications for another decade before committing to any position. Species who had been members for 8,000 years suddenly found themselves revisiting assumptions they had not examined since their own first contact. SSS Velith sat in the observer gallery and watched the arguments and thought about probability. 94.7% chance of self-extinction. A civilization that had looked at that number, its own diagnosis, arrived at independently, and had decided to become the 5.3%. Not by becoming peaceful, not by solving their contradictions, but by containing them, by taking everything that made them dangerous to each other and deciding, collectively, that it could be pointed outward instead. By building reckoning not as a weapon of conquest but as a statement, "We are still here, and we want a seat at the table, and we would prefer if you gave us one." They had not come in weakness, asking to be welcomed. They had come in uncertainty, offering terms. That was the thing, SSS Velith realized, that none of the Council had quite articulated yet. Humans were frightening not because they were strong, strength was manageable, strength could be measured and countered, but because they had arrived already knowing they might lose and had done the maths and decided to try anyway. The universe had seen conquerors. It had seen diplomats. It had seen cowards and visionaries and desperate last-gamble species broadcasting into the void. It had not, until now, seen anything quite so stubbornly, irrationally, and specifically human as this. Admiral Sorokina, when SSS Velith relayed the Council's continued deliberation, simply nodded. "Take the time you need," she said. "We've waited 80 years. We can wait a little longer." She looked out the viewport at Reckoning, 340 kilometers of black steel and compressed audacity, hanging in the dark between the stars. "We're good at waiting," she said, "when we have to be.